Malik Devran walked into the courtroom like he owned it, and Judge Raymond Clive felt something no law, no force, had ever prepared him for: a sudden, crushing wave of exhaustion that blurred his vision and shook his hands. The trial had been the city's biggest mystery long before it even began. People waited for years to see the notorious gangster Malik Devran finally brought into a courtroom after escaping every trap set for him. His name was spoken in fear, whispered in alleys, and connected to crimes that stretched far beyond the city's borders. Every neighborhood had a story about him, and every victim's family carried the hope that one day he would face justice. When the day finally arrived, the courthouse became a fortress. Barricades were set up, helicopters circled overhead, and officers lined every corner as citizens gathered outside in nervous anticipation. Malik's arrival made the air feel heavier. He stepped out of the armored van, wearing a plain black suit, and walked with a calmness that didn't match the severity of his charges. Reporters captured every second, but even through their cameras, something felt strange. The crowd went silent, almost as if the moment demanded respect or fear. People expected excitement or chaos, yet instead, a cold quiet spread over the entire street. Malik didn't make any sudden movements. He simply walked forward, but the atmosphere reacted as if a storm had passed through without warning. Inside the courthouse, officers tightened security and double-checked every hallway. No one trusted Malik's past, and many believed he still had loyal followers ready to intervene. Yet when he walked through the main doors, the building itself seemed to react. The fluorescent lights flickered for a brief second, long enough for everyone to notice. The temperature dropped slightly, enough to send a small shiver through those closest to him. People told themselves it was their imagination, caused by stress or fear, but the feeling didn't fade. Every footstep Malik took echoed louder than it should have. The corridors felt longer, and time seemed to stretch as he made his way toward Courtroom 7, where Judge Raymond Clive waited. The judge was a respected figure, known for dealing harshly with criminals who believed they were untouchable. He had sentenced drug lords, corrupt officials, and violent offenders without ever flinching. But this case felt different before it even started. Malik wasn't just another criminal. He was the symbol of a decade of terror, corruption, and unresolved secrets. News crews outside reported that people watching from their screens felt uneasy, as though something invisible walked behind Malik. The officers escorting him kept glancing sideways, unsure why the hallway seemed dimmer than before. A sense of quiet pressure built in the air, the kind of heaviness one feels before a major disaster. Malik walked without showing any emotion, as if he had already accepted the outcome or no longer cared what happened next. As he entered the courtroom, the silence grew sharper. Every eye turned toward him, and even the strongest officers felt a strange tension in their chests. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was something deeper and harder to explain, like the room itself was reacting to his presence. The trial everyone had waited for had officially begun, but no one realized something darker was stepping into that courtroom with him, something that would test the limits of everyone present and change the entire case in ways no one could predict. Judge Raymond Clive had faced criminals of every kind throughout his career, but nothing prepared him for the moment Malik Devran walked into his courtroom. At first, he tried to dismiss the unease, creeping over him as simple stress. Years of experience had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to maintain control, even when facing the most dangerous individuals. But this was different. The instant Malik stepped through the courtroom doors, a wave of exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. His legs felt heavy, as though the weight of the entire city pressed down on him. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted them to adjust his robe, and for the first time in his career, he felt his mind blur at the edges. At first, Judge Clive assumed it was fatigue from the long hours preparing for the case. He had spent nights reviewing evidence, memorizing testimony, and considering every possible scenario. But the unusual weakness refused to subside. His vision dimmed at the periphery, and even the air in the courtroom seemed thicker than usual. Each breath felt heavy, each heartbeat sluggish. He leaned against the bench for support, hoping no one would notice, but the court officers observed the sudden change in his demeanor. Whispers began to circulate among the staff, who were normally trained to remain stoic no matter the situation. Something was undeniably wrong, though no one could immediately explain why. As the trial began, Judge Clive struggled to maintain focus. Documents and evidence that he had studied meticulously felt confusing in his hands. Pages appeared to blur together, and numbers he had memorized swam in front of his eyes. He found himself rereading paragraphs multiple times, only to realize he couldn't remember what he had just read. For a man accustomed to absolute control, it was disorienting and frightening. He could feel his body betraying him in ways he had never experienced before, and he began to notice that other courtroom attendees seemed affected as well. Even seasoned lawyers felt tense and unsettled, their normally sharp focus dulled in subtle but significant ways. The judge's aides tried discreetly to offer support, bringing water and adjusting lighting, but nothing seemed to help. Each time Malik moved, Judge Clive felt the fatigue deepen, a creeping darkness that spread from his limbs to his mind. He wondered if he had underestimated Malik's influence. The thought alone was unsettling. Was this simply the fear the gangster commanded, or was something more sinister at play? The notion seemed almost impossible, yet the physical sensations were undeniable. Observers later recalled the way the courtroom seemed to shift in Malik's presence. Even the acoustics changed slightly, as though the room itself had taken on a heavier, more oppressive atmosphere. Judge Clive's normally sharp commands sounded distant to his own ears, and he struggled to project authority as he read the charges aloud. Every movement required conscious effort, and he could feel the invisible strain of Malik's presence pressing down on him. By the end of the first morning, Judge Clive had to pause the proceedings, citing a sudden health concern. No one knew the truth. It wasn't the illness or stress alone that had forced him to step aside, but something inexplicably linked to Malik. The courtroom left in stunned silence, a tension hanging that was heavier than any fear they had known before. Everyone realized, whether consciously or not, that the trial would not proceed as usual. Something inside the courtroom had changed, and it would take more than law and procedure to navigate what was coming next. Malik Devran's reputation had always been shrouded in mystery, but as investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover a secret that few could have imagined. Rumors had circulated for years about a rare condition he carried, something the medical world barely recognized, and the criminal world barely feared. It was known among a select few as black fatigue syndrome, a condition that seemed to drain the energy and focus of anyone nearby. Scientists described it as a complex psychological and neurological anomaly, triggered not by physical contact, but by prolonged exposure to a certain presence or influence. In simple terms, Malik didn't just command fear with his actions. He commanded it with his very being. The origins of black fatigue were murky. Some accounts suggested it stemmed from Malik's early days in a reclusive, secretive cult operating on the outskirts of the city. The cult was rumored to experiment with ancient techniques that could manipulate human energy, weakening minds without leaving a visible mark. Malik had reportedly spent months immersed in these rituals, learning how to focus his presence and intent to produce a measurable effect on those around him. To outsiders, it seemed supernatural, but investigators suspected a combination of psychological conditioning, precise behavioral cues, and subtle environmental manipulation. Even before entering courtrooms or committing violent acts, Malik's aura created an invisible barrier. Law enforcement officers who had attempted to arrest him described sudden fatigue, headaches, and confusion, often at the exact moment he appeared. Detectives called it a mental fog that clouded judgment and slowed reactions. Witnesses remembered similar experiences, an unshakable exhaustion, disorientation, or an eerie emptiness when Malik was present. Unlike fear that could be resisted through courage, black fatigue was more insidious. It attacked the body and mind simultaneously, leaving victims weakened without understanding why. Investigators studying Malik's past discovered patterns that confirmed suspicions about the condition. In every high-profile confrontation, reports indicated that those who approached him first experienced symptoms consistent with black fatigue. Whether police officers, rival gang members, or witnesses in criminal trials, the results were the same: confusion, inability to focus, and often complete collapse. This explained why Malik had evaded capture for so long, despite overwhelming evidence. His criminal strategies were meticulously planned, but the additional advantage of subtly weakening anyone in proximity made him nearly untouchable. Medical experts brought in to study the phenomenon were perplexed. Black fatigue did not fit traditional neurological or psychological diagnoses. Vital signs, brain scans, and reflex tests often appeared normal until the afflicted were in close contact with Malik, at which point sudden changes occurred: blood pressure spikes, rapid fatigue, and impaired cognitive function. Some scientists speculated that Malik had learned to subconsciously emit signals, visual cues, tonal shifts, even micro-movements that triggered physiological responses in others. Others believed there might be a form of undetectable electromagnetic influence at play, intentionally or unknowingly harnessed. The discovery of Malik's condition shifted the strategy for the trial. Court officials began to realize that this was not just a legal challenge, but a test of human endurance and control. Every judge, officer, and lawyer who stepped into the courtroom could potentially be affected. What had seemed like a routine trial now revealed itself to be a psychological battleground, with Malik at its center. The city and its legal system were confronting a criminal whose power extended beyond weapons and influence. It reached into the very minds of those who sought to hold him accountable. By understanding black fatigue syndrome, authorities hoped they could develop methods to resist it. But the question remained: could anyone truly stand against Malik Devran without succumbing to the invisible force that accompanied him? The stakes of the trial had risen far beyond justice. They had become a test of human resilience in the face of something no one could see, but everyone could feel. The case against Malik Devran seemed airtight at first. Investigators had gathered mountains of evidence over the years: ledgers filled with coded transactions, photographs of illicit shipments, recordings of covert meetings, and eyewitness testimonies from victims and accomplices alike. Every detail had been meticulously documented, cross-checked, and verified. Prosecutors believed that once the trial began, the evidence would speak for itself. Yet almost immediately, strange disruptions began to surface, throwing the courtroom into chaos. Documents that had been signed, sealed, and logged began to vanish inexplicably. Files on the court's secure server appeared corrupted, as though someone or something had manipulated the data from within. Even surveillance footage, meant to record every moment of Malik's prior activities, displayed strange glitches. At key moments, frames were missing or distorted, erasing crucial details. Court staff were baffled. The IT department insisted that there was no malware, no hacking, no plausible explanation for the sudden failures. Cameras were double-checked, backups were restored, and yet the anomalies persisted. Fingerprints on evidence that had been carefully preserved appeared smudged or altered without any physical contact. Investigators who touched the materials sometimes reported headaches, lightheadedness, or a strange sense of disorientation, eerily reminiscent of the black fatigue syndrome associated with Malik. It became increasingly clear that this was no ordinary case of legal tampering. Something more subtle, more insidious, was at work. The courtroom itself seemed to become a character in the unfolding mystery. When Malik was present, objects shifted slightly, papers slipping off desks, chairs tilting as though nudged by an unseen hand. Officers guarding the evidence felt inexplicable fatigue, as if their concentration was being actively drained. Lawyers who had spent weeks preparing opening statements found themselves suddenly forgetting critical points. Witnesses reported feeling an almost magnetic pull of distraction whenever Malik entered the room, their attention slipping in ways they could not explain. Each attempt to control the chaos only seemed to deepen it. Even prosecutors began questioning their own reliability. A key piece of evidence, a ledger detailing millions in illicit transactions, inexplicably went missing for an hour before reappearing untouched on a different table. Notes taken during depositions were found scattered in incorrect order, with some pages entirely blank. The effect was cumulative, affecting not just individuals, but the court's operations as a whole. Judges and clerks struggled to keep proceedings orderly, while Malik maintained his usual calm, seemingly impervious to the disruptions around him. Investigators began to suspect that Malik's rare condition, black fatigue syndrome, might extend beyond mere human influence. Perhaps it allowed him to subtly manipulate his environment, creating a psychological and physical ripple effect that interfered with people's ability to perform even routine tasks. Technicians conducted controlled experiments with evidence under his observation and found anomalies, impossible to explain through ordinary means. Videos captured his presence as a kind of trigger, causing disturbances in digital and physical systems alike. The more the trial progressed, the more it became apparent that Malik Devran had weaponized the courtroom itself. This was not just a battle over evidence or testimony. It was a contest of endurance and control. Every document, every recording, every physical item in the room could be affected. Prosecutors and investigators were forced to adapt, meticulously documenting every irregularity while trying to maintain focus. What had begun as a straightforward case now revealed itself as an unprecedented psychological labyrinth, where truth, perception, and reality were all at the mercy of a single mysterious presence. By the end of the first week, the courtroom had transformed from a place of law and order into a tense arena of uncertainty. Evidence could no longer be trusted at face value, and every move by those seeking justice was shadowed by the possibility of unseen interference. Malik's mastery over chaos had become as formidable as his criminal empire, and anyone hoping to see him convicted realized that conventional methods might not be enough. In the world of law, where certainty and proof were paramount, Malik Devran had introduced a variable no one knew how to counter, a force that could unravel the strongest cases before they could even reach a verdict. Every witness called to testify against Malik Devran faced a challenge far greater than the questions put to them. It was as though an invisible weight pressed down on anyone who stepped forward, a subtle but undeniable force that made speaking, thinking, or even standing difficult. The first witness, a young man who had worked for Malik in the outskirts of the city, approached the stand with confidence, prepared to reveal key details of the criminal network. Yet as soon as he entered Malik's line of sight, a wave of dizziness overtook him. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grip the railing for support. He struggled to recall basic details, forgetting names, dates, and locations he had memorized perfectly just hours before. Court officers caught him before he collapsed completely, and the proceedings were briefly halted. The pattern repeated itself throughout the day. A woman who had survived one of Malik's violent operations fainted before she could give her statement. Another man, a former accomplice who had agreed to cooperate, suddenly froze mid-testimony, mumbling incoherently, and had to be escorted from the room. These incidents were not mere coincidences. Each witness experienced a distinct form of mental and physical weakening. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like a creeping fog that clouded memory, blurred vision, and drained energy. Lawyers and court staff began keeping detailed notes, realizing that conventional legal strategies would not suffice when those who knew the truth could not even stand to speak it. Even seasoned detectives who had previously arrested Malik found themselves disoriented when testifying. They reported intense fatigue, trembling hands, and difficulty focusing on simple facts. Some were forced to leave the stand for medical attention. The cumulative effect of these episodes began to erode confidence in the trial. The courtroom, once a place of order and authority, started to feel unpredictable, almost hostile. Observers whispered that Malik's presence seemed to carry a physical and psychological influence, and the jury struggled to remain attentive without succumbing to similar effects. The Judge Raymond Clive was no exception. Though he had already experienced the mysterious fatigue during the first hearings, the repeated collapse of witnesses added to his growing unease. Each failed testimony heightened his own sense of strain, reminding him that the trial was no longer just a legal battle, but a psychological confrontation. The court began implementing measures to limit Malik's direct interactions with witnesses, including positioning him further from the stand and requiring physical barriers during questioning. Despite these efforts, the impact remained. Psychologists called in to observe the proceedings noted that the symptoms displayed by the witnesses mirrored those associated with black fatigue syndrome, the rare condition linked to Malik. Mental clarity slipped, focus deteriorated, and physical stamina faltered almost immediately when in his proximity. Even those immune to fear found themselves affected. It became increasingly clear that Malik had weaponized his own presence, turning the courtroom into a tool of intimidation that went far beyond simple menace. By the end of the week, the trial had shifted into uncharted territory. Witnesses who should have been the strongest pillars of the prosecution were crumbling under an invisible influence. Every statement, every recollection, and every piece of testimony risked being compromised, not by deceit, but by an inexplicable force that seemed to sap the mind and body. What had begun as a straightforward pursuit of justice had evolved into a battle against an unseen power, one that tested not only the courage of those who dared to confront Malik Devran, but also the limits of human endurance itself. The courtroom had become a silent battlefield, and the question on everyone's mind was whether anyone could survive it long enough to bring the gangster to justice. When the trial seemed to be collapsing under the weight of unexplained fatigue and failing witnesses, a new figure entered the courtroom: Investigator Zara Hales, known for her resilience and ability to handle cases that had broken the nerves of others. She approached Malik's trial with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Unlike the previous investigators and officers, she did not seem affected by the oppressive energy that radiated from Malik. Her focus remained sharp, her movements precise, and her mind clear. From the first moment she observed him, she noticed anomalies that others had either dismissed or failed to recognize. The air seemed heavier around him. Subtle shifts in temperature rippled through the room, and the lights flickered almost imperceptibly when he moved. These were signs no ordinary criminal could produce, and Zara knew that understanding them was key to unraveling the trial. Zara began her investigation quietly, observing Malik and documenting every unusual event in the courtroom. She tracked the moments when witnesses faltered, when documents went missing or corrupted, and when officers felt sudden exhaustion. Patterns began to emerge. Each effect seemed to correlate directly with Malik's proximity or actions. While others saw chaos, Zara saw a calculated influence, a systematic weakening of everyone around him. It became clear that black fatigue syndrome, previously thought to be a medical condition, might actually be a controlled method of psychological manipulation. Malik had trained himself to exploit it, turning the courtroom into a trap for anyone who approached him unprepared. Determined to gather evidence, Zara ventured into Malik's past, examining properties he had abandoned when he first disappeared from public scrutiny. There, she discovered hidden rooms and secret compartments filled with notebooks, electronic devices, and strange diagrams. The writings suggested experiments in controlling human focus and energy, testing subtle signals, micro-movements, and even sound frequencies that could affect mental clarity. Some devices were capable of producing low vibrations that, while almost imperceptible, seemed to exacerbate the fatigue effect in those nearby. It became evident that Malik's influence was not entirely innate. He had refined it through deliberate practice and experimentation. Zara shared her findings with the court, but skepticism remained. Many could not accept that a single person could so profoundly affect others without touching them. Yet, as she demonstrated controlled experiments with Malik's equipment, small panels of the court witnessed firsthand the draining effect his presence could trigger. Officers who had previously collapsed managed to maintain stability when barriers were introduced or distance was enforced. The connection was undeniable. The more Zara uncovered, the more she realized the depth of Malik's preparation. His criminal genius was intertwined with his mastery of influence, making him nearly untouchable. Standard legal procedures were inadequate. To convict him, the court needed not only evidence, but also a method to neutralize the psychological pressure he exerted. Her work became critical to preserving the trial. By the time Zara returned to the courtroom with her findings, the environment had subtly changed. Witnesses were better protected, and the court staff had implemented measures to shield themselves from Malik's presence. Even Judge Clive, though still weakened, felt renewed confidence in managing the proceedings. For the first time, it seemed possible that the trial could continue without collapsing under the invisible force that had controlled every session before. Yet even with these precautions, Zara knew one truth. Malik Devran had prepared for every contingency, and neutralizing him would require more than strategy. It would demand endurance, courage, and precision from everyone involved. The battle was no longer just about law. It had become a confrontation with a criminal who had weaponized human perception itself. And Zara Hales was the first to step into that fight, fully aware of the stakes. Judge Raymond Clive had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure. But the relentless fatigue he experienced during Malik Devran's trial tested him in ways he had never imagined. Each day in the courtroom, the invisible weight seemed to grow heavier. Witnesses faltered, evidence became unreliable, and even seasoned officers struggled to maintain focus. It was clear that conventional measures were no longer sufficient. The judge realized that continuing the trial in the same manner would risk complete collapse. He had to act decisively, relying not only on the law, but also on a strategy to counter the insidious influence Malik exerted over everyone around him. Clive began with a private review of the evidence gathered by investigator Zara Hales. Her discoveries revealed the deliberate techniques and devices Malik had used to manipulate human focus and stamina. The judge understood that the courtroom itself had become a tool in Malik's hands. Documents had been tampered with, testimonies compromised, and officers fatigued at critical moments. This manipulation was subtle yet effective, designed to erode the prosecution's ability to present a coherent case. Clive recognized that unless Malik's presence was controlled, the trial could never reach a fair verdict. With careful planning, Clive implemented measures to neutralize the gangster's influence. Malik was placed behind a reinforced glass chamber, physically separated from witnesses and court staff while still visible to the jury. Officers were instructed to maintain strict distance and avoid direct line of sight whenever possible. Judges and lawyers wore devices that monitored their vitals, alerting them to early signs of fatigue or cognitive strain. Each witness was briefed and trained to maintain composure under the subtle pressure that Malik's presence could exert. The courtroom became a controlled environment, designed to minimize the psychological and physical impact of black fatigue syndrome. Even with these precautions, the judge had to push himself beyond his limits. Each day, he fought through dizziness, headaches, and a growing sense of heaviness in his limbs. He meticulously reviewed each testimony, scrutinized every document, and cross-checked evidence against the anomalies reported during earlier sessions. Clive understood that any lapse could give Malik an opening, allowing him to manipulate the trial once again. His determination became a quiet battle of endurance. Matching the gangster's insidious power with sheer will and vigilance, the courtroom slowly regained a sense of order. Witnesses who had previously collapsed or forgotten critical details were now able to testify with clarity. Evidence that had appeared corrupted or tampered with was carefully reconstructed, its integrity preserved under the judge's strict supervision. Malik, isolated behind the glass, maintained his calm demeanor, but his usual subtle influence was diminished. The measures put in place limited his ability to induce fatigue and disorientation, allowing the legal process to proceed more effectively. Clive's strategy was not without risk. He knew that any misstep, any lapse in attention or judgment, could give Malik a chance to regain control. The judge had to remain vigilant at all times, balancing the demands of the law with the need to resist the psychological pressure Malik exerted. Each day in the courtroom became a test of endurance, patience, and mental fortitude. By the time the trial reached its midpoint, it was clear that Judge Clive's intervention had fundamentally changed the dynamics. The prosecution was finally able to present evidence coherently. Witnesses spoke without collapsing, and the courtroom's order was maintained. Malik Devran remained a formidable presence, but his influence had been contained. The trial continued, not just as a legal proceeding, but as a testament to human resilience, a battle of minds and wills against a criminal who had weaponized perception itself. The judge's unwavering determination became the foundation upon which justice might finally be served, even in the face of forces no one had ever encountered before. The courtroom had never felt lighter, yet a lingering tension remained. Malik Devran, once an almost untouchable presence, was now contained behind the reinforced glass chamber. Witnesses could speak without fear of collapsing. Evidence could be reviewed without mysterious interference, and the legal proceedings finally regained momentum. For the first time, the prosecution and the judge felt a glimmer of control over the trial. Every testimony aligned, every document matched the records, and the jury could now absorb the facts without the oppressive weight of black fatigue syndrome clouding their perception. It seemed that the battle might finally be won. Judge Raymond Clive prepared to deliver the final verdict, feeling a cautious sense of triumph. Months of planning, endurance, and vigilance had allowed the trial to reach this point. Witnesses had recovered, the court staff had adapted, and the jury had a clear understanding of Malik's extensive criminal operations. The city outside watched with anticipation, hopeful that justice would finally prevail against a man who had eluded capture for years. Even the press, which had been both fearful and fascinated by Malik's aura of invincibility, began to report cautiously optimistic stories about the trial's progress. Yet, just as the final proceedings were about to begin, a subtle, almost imperceptible change occurred. The lights in the courtroom flickered briefly, drawing everyone's attention. A low vibration ran through the floor, barely noticeable, but enough to cause papers to shuffle, and a faint shiver to run through the officers standing guard. The glass chamber containing Malik remained intact, unbroken, and locked, yet the sensation was undeniable. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if reacting to an invisible force that no one could see. Court officers rushed to check the chamber, expecting to find a breach or tampering, but everything was in place. Malik Devran was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of an escape, no damage to the locks or the glass. Surveillance footage revealed nothing beyond a slight flicker at the moment of his disappearance, as if he had simply evaporated into the air. The courtroom erupted in confusion and fear. Lawyers, staff, and the jury struggled to comprehend what had happened. How could a man vanish from a reinforced, monitored chamber without leaving any trace? It defied logic, defied reason, and defied the entire legal system that had fought so hard to bring him to justice. Speculation ran rampant. Some suggested a last surge of black fatigue had enabled Malik to manipulate the environment in ways no one had previously observed. Others believed he had prepared a secret method of escape, one hidden so thoroughly that even the most meticulous investigation could not detect it. Some whispered darker possibilities, that Malik's influence had extended beyond the physical, a force capable of bending perception itself. Authorities intensified their search, but weeks of investigation yielded no clues. Malik Devran had vanished completely, leaving the courtroom, the city, and the legal system in stunned silence. The trial officially ended, but the story of Malik Devran did not. His disappearance became the stuff of legend, a cautionary tale of a criminal whose power reached beyond weapons, money, or influence. The city remained on alert, wary of the man who could weaken minds and manipulate perception. Judge Clive and his team were hailed for their perseverance, but even they could not shake the unsettling truth. Malik Devran had mastered a force no court could fully contain, leaving behind a legacy of fear, mystery, and unanswered questions. Some said he would return, and every unexplained moment of weakness in a crowded room reminded the city that the gangster might already be among them, waiting for the next opportunity to strike.